This history of Catholic fasting and abstinence is taken from the 8-part series written by Matthew Plese for the Fatima Center. He is the author of Understanding the Precepts of the Church and he serves as the president of CatechismClass.com. Parts of this overview are addressed in more detail in other articles of his on the topic of fasting and abstinence. Sadly, most of what is related here is completely unknown by modern Catholics. Relearning our history is a must. And for that reason, a history of fasting and abstinence is presented. We begin in the beginning with fasting in biblical times. In the beginning, the very first commandment of God to Adam and Eve was one of fasting from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and their failure to fast brought sin and disorder to all of creation. The second sin of mankind was gluttony. Both are intricately tied to fasting. Both Elijah and Moses fasted for 40 days in the Old Testament before seeing God. Until the Great Flood, man abstained entirely from the flesh meat of animals. Likewise, in the New Testament, St. John the Baptist, the greatest prophet fasted, and his followers were characterized by their fasting. And our blessed Lord also fasted for 40 days, not for his own needs but to serve as an example for us. Our Redeemer said, "Unless you shall do penance, you shall all likewise perish." Fasting and abstinence from certain foods characterize the lives of man since the foundation of the world. The purpose of fasting. The Church has hallowed the practice of fasting, encourages it, and mandates it at certain times. Why? The angelic doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas, writes that fasting is practiced for a threefold purpose. First, in order to bridle the lusts of the flesh. Secondly, we have recourse to fasting in order that the mind may arise more freely to the contemplation of heavenly things. Hence it is related of Daniel that he received a revelation from God after fasting for 3 weeks. Thirdly, in order to satisfy for sins, wherefore it is written, "Be converted to me with all your heart, in fasting and in weeping and in mourning." The same is declared by Augustine in a sermon. Fasting cleanses the soul, raises the mind, subjects one's flesh to the spirit, renders the heart contrite and humble, scatters the clouds of concupiscence, quenches the fire of lust, kindles the true light of chastity. Saint Basil the Great also affirmed the importance of fasting for protection against demonic forces. The fast is the weapon of protection against demons. Our guardian angels more really stay with those who have cleansed our souls through fasting. The Baltimore Catechism echoes these sentiments. The Church commands us to fast and abstain, in order that we may mortify our passions and satisfy for our sins. Concerning this rationale, Father Thomas Kincaid in an explanation of the Baltimore Catechism of Christian Doctrine published in 1891 writes, "Remember it is our bodies that generally lead us into sin. If therefore we punish the body by fasting and mortification, we atone for the sin, and thus God wipes out a part of the temporal punishment due to it." Pope St. Leo the Great in 461 wisely counseled that fasting is a means and not an end in itself. For those who could not observe the strictness of fasting, he sensibly said, "What we forego by fasting is to be given as alms to the poor." To simply forego fasting completely, even when for legitimate health reasons, does not excuse a person from the universal command to do penance. To love fasting. The Rule of Saint Benedict written in 516 AD by the illustrious Saint Benedict states in part, "O Lord, I place myself in your hands and dedicate myself to you. I pledge myself to do your will in all things, to love the Lord God with all my heart, all my soul, all my strength. Not to kill. Not to steal, to chastise the body. Not to seek after pleasures. To love fasting." How can we love fasting? Father Adalbert de Vogue, OSB explains, "To love fasting one must experience it, but to experience it one must love it. The way to get out of this circle is easy: trust in the Word of God, in the example of the saints, in the great voice of tradition. And trusting in this witness, try it." To love fasting is our goal. Fasting should never be performed without an increase in prayer or almsgiving. It should not be performed grudgingly and in anger. Likewise, it should not be performed for the vain purpose of losing weight or even for the natural good of improving one's health. Fasting must have God as its end. Purpose of studying fasting and abstinence. Fasting is one of the chief means of penance we can perform to make satisfaction for sin, as Our Lady of Fatima repeatedly called for. Understanding the decline of fasting over time in the Church should inspire us to observe these older customs and to encourage other Catholics to do so for the purpose of making satisfaction for sin. The history of fasting in the Catholic Church, like other disciplines, has undergone considerable changes throughout the centuries. Unlike dogma, which is unchangeable, disciplines like fasting may change over time. However, in a modern church that legislates fasting only 2 days a year, we find a woefully lacking answer to heaven's incessant calls for penance and reparation. Fasting in the early church. Fasting has been a part of the Catholic Church since the time of the Apostles, who instituted fasting shortly after our Redeemer's ascension into heaven. Fasting in the Apostolic Age constituted 2 primary fasting periods, the weekly devotional fasts and the Lenten fast. In the early Church, fasting, which included abstinence as part of it, was widely observed each week on Wednesday and Friday. This practice is kept by some pious Catholics and Eastern Catholics. The Didache, the teaching of the Apostles, written by the end of the 1st century, states in chapter 8, "But let not your fasts be with the hypocrites, for they fast on the 2nd and 5th day of the week, but fast on the 4th day and the preparation." Since Sunday is the first day of the week, the 4th day referred to Wednesday and the day of preparation referred to Friday. The phrase day of preparation preceding the Sabbath on Saturday occurs in the Scriptures in Matthew 27:62, Mark 15:42, Luke 23:54, and John 19:14-31-42. All such instances unequivocally confirm that it refers to Friday. On the rationale for fasting on these days, St. Peter of Alexandria, Patriarch of Alexandria until his death in 311 AD, explains, "On Wednesday because on this day the council of the Jews was gathered to betray our Lord, on Friday because on this day he suffered death for our salvation." Likewise, the 1875 Catechism of Father Michael Müller adds, "This practice began with Christianity itself, as we learn from St. Epiphanius, who says, 'It is ordained, by the law of the Apostles, to fast 2 days of the week.'" Some places added Saturday fasting as well, as noted by St. Francis de Sales, who writes, "The early Christians selected Wednesday, Friday and Saturday as days of abstinence." Saturday fasting eventually became extended to the entire Church in the early 400s by Pope Innocent I, who wrote, "Reason shows most clearly that we should fast on Saturday, because it stood between the sadness of Good Friday and the joy of Easter Sunday." The Douay Catechism, written in 1649, explains the rationale for Saturday abstinence, which was then still universally practiced, even though the weekly fast on Saturday had long ended by that time, to prepare ourselves for a devout keeping of the Sunday, as also in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who stood firm in the faith on that day, the Apostles themselves wavering. The Apostolic origin of the Lenten fast. The great liturgical Dom Guéranger writes that the fast which precedes Easter originated with the Apostles themselves. The 40 days fast, which we call Lent, is the Church's preparation for Easter, and was instituted at the very commencement of Christianity. Our blessed Lord himself sanctioned it by fasting 40 days and 40 nights in the desert, and though he would not impose it on the world by an express commandment, which, in that case, could not have been open to the power of dispensation, yet he showed plainly enough, by his own example, that fasting, which God had so frequently ordered in the Old Law, was to be also practiced by the children of the New. The Apostles, therefore, legislated for our weakness, by instituting, at the very commencement of the Christian Church, that the solemnity of Easter should be preceded by a universal fast. The Catechism of the Liturgy by a Religious of the Sacred Heart, published by the Paulist Press, New York, 1919, affirms the apostolic origin of the Lenten fast. The Lenten fast dates back to apostolic times, as is attested by St. Jerome, St. Leo the Great, St. Cyril of Alexandria and others. In the 2nd century, St. Irenaeus wrote to Pope St. Victor I inquiring about how Easter should be celebrated, while mentioning the practice of fasting leading up to Easter. Initially, the Lenten fast was practiced by catechumens preparing for their baptism 7, with the universal fast for all the faithful observed only during Holy Week, in addition to the weekly fasts that were devotionally practiced. But early on, the baptized Christians began to join the catechumens in fasting on the days immediately preceding Easter. The duration of the fast varied, with some churches observing 1 day, others several days, and yet others observing intensive 40-hour fasting, in honor of the 40 hours that the Lord spent in the sepulchre. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the fast became 40 days in most places. Saint Athanasius in 339 AD referred to the Lenten fast as a 40-day fast that the whole world observed. Shortly after the legislation of Christianity in the Roman Empire, the bishops at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD fixed the date of Easter as the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. The canons emerging from that council also referenced a 40-day Lenten season of fasting. The Lenten fast was not a merely devotional fast but one of precept under penalty of sin. Father Stephen Keenan's Catechism from 1846 quotes St. Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430 AD, as saying, "Our fast at any other time is voluntary, but during Lent, we sin if we do not fast." To the early Christians, fasting was performed until sundown, in imitation of the previous Jewish tradition. Dom Guéranger's writings affirm, it was the custom with the Jews, in the Old Law, not to take the one meal, allowed on fasting days, till sunset. The Christian Church adopted the same custom. It was scrupulously practiced, for many centuries, even in our Western countries. But, about the 9th century, some relaxation began to be introduced in the Latin Church. Fasting included abstinence from meat, fish, and all animal products, for example dairy and eggs. And notably in the early Church, fasting also included abstinence from wine, taking man back to the same diet that mankind practiced before God permitted Noah to eat meat or drink wine. For this reason, even in the Eastern Church today some fasting periods prohibit wine. As such, in apostolic times, the main meal was a small one mainly of bread and vegetables. Fish only became allowed in the 6th century on days of abstinence, but richer shellfish remained prohibited for several more centuries. While not as ancient as the Holy Week fast, the Advent fast originated in the early Church by at least the 4th century. The Catechism of the Liturgy describes the fast leading up to Christmas. In a passage of St. Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks, we find that St. Perpetuus, one of his predecessors in the see, had decreed in 480 AD that the faithful should fast 3 times a week from the feast of St. Martin, on November 11th, up to Christmas. This period was called St. Martin's Lent and his feast was kept with the same kind of rejoicing as Carnival. In historical records, Advent was originally called the 40 Days Fast of St. Martin. The Catechism of the Liturgy notes that this observance of fasting likely lasted until the 12th century. Remnants of this fast remained in the Roman Rite through the 19th century when Wednesday and Friday fasting in Advent continued to be mandated in most countries. The observance of another fast leading up to the feast of Saints Peter and Paul also originated in the early Church under Pope St. Leo the Great around the year 461. At the time of St. Jerome, it was known as Summer Lent, though it was not practiced under obligation like the fast of Lent itself. While it subsequently fell out of observance in the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Catholic Church still observes this fast to some extent. The Roman Catholic Church though maintained the summer ember days during this time, in addition to the traditional fast on the vigil of Saints Peter and Paul, until modern times. As a result, only a fragment of the fasting that was originally practiced persisted. Lenten fasting in the medieval Church, 5th through the 13th century. How was Lenten fasting observed? As mentioned previously, the Lenten fast began under the apostles themselves and was practiced in various forms. St. Augustine in the 4th century remarked, "Our fast at any other time is voluntary, but during Lent, we sin if we do not fast." At the time of St. Gregory the Great at the beginning of the 7th century, the fast was universally established to begin on what we know as Ash Wednesday. While the name Ash Wednesday was not given to the day until Pope Urban II in 1099, the day was known as the beginning of the fast. Regarding Holy Saturday's fast, in particular, Canon 89 of the Council in Trullo in 692 AD provides an account of the piety and devotion of the faithful of that time. The faithful, spending the days of the salutatory Passion in fasting, praying and compunction of heart, ought to fast until the midnight of the great Sabbath, since the divine evangelists, Matthew and Luke, have shown us how late at night it was that the resurrection took place. That tradition of fasting on Holy Saturday until midnight would last for centuries. Historical records further indicate that Lent was not a merely regional practice observed only in Rome. It was part of the universality of the Church. Lenten fasting began in England, for instance, sometime during the reign of Earconbet, the King of Kent, who was converted by the missionary work of St. Augustine of Canterbury in England. During the Middle Ages, fasting in England, and many other than Catholic nations, was required both by church law and civil law. Catholic missionaries brought fasting, which is an integral part of the faith, to every land they visited. Collations are introduced on fasting days. The rules on fasting remain largely the same for hundreds of years. Food was to be taken once a day after sunset. By midnight, the fast resumed and was terminated only after the sun had once again set on the horizon. But relaxations were to soon begin. By the 8th century, The time for the daily meal was moved to the time that the monks would pray the office of nun in the divine office. This office takes place around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. As a consequence of moving the meal up in the day, the practice of a collation was introduced. The well-researched Father Francis Xavier Weiser summarizes this major change with fasting. It was not until the 9th century, however, that less rigid laws of fasting were introduced. It came about in 817 when the monks of the Benedictine order, who did much labor in the fields and on the farms, were allowed to take a little drink with a morsel of bread in the evening. Eventually, the Church extended the new laws to the laity as well, and by the end of the medieval times they had become universal practice. Everybody ate a little evening meal in addition to the main meal at noon. How was Lenten abstinence observed? In 604, in a letter to St. Augustine of Canterbury, Pope St. Gregory the Great announced the form that abstinence would take on fast days. This form would last for almost 1,000 years. We abstain from flesh meat and from all things that come from flesh, as milk, cheese, and eggs. When fasting was observed, abstinence was likewise always observed. Through the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, we can learn how Lent was practiced in his own time and attempt to willingly observe such practices in our own lives. The Lenten fast is mentioned by St. Thomas Aquinas constituted of the following. Monday through Saturday were days of fasting. The meal was taken at midday and a collation was allowed at night, except on days of the Black Fast. All meat or animal products were prohibited throughout Lent. Abstinence from these foods remained even on Sundays of Lent, though fasting was not practiced on Sundays. No food was to be eaten at all on either Ash Wednesday or Good Friday. Holy Week was a more intense fast that consisted only of bread, salt, water, and herbs. The Lenten fast included fasting from all lactocinia, which is Latin for milk products, which included butter, cheese, eggs, and animal products. From this tradition, Easter eggs were introduced, and therefore the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday is when pancakes are traditionally eaten to use leftover lactocinia. And similarly, Fat Tuesday is known as Carnival, coming from the Latin words carne levar, literally the farewell to meat. Regarding this point, there are important exceptions to note as the Church has always exercised common sense. Father Weiser notes that abstinence from lactocinia, which included milk, butter, cheese, and eggs, was never strictly enforced in Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia because of the lack of oil and other substitute foods in those countries. The Church, using common sense, granted many dispensations in this matter in all countries of Europe. People who did eat the milk foods would often, when they could afford it, give alms for the building of churches or other pious endeavors. Besides the Lenten fast, the tradition of Rogation days, Ember days, and the Advent fast developed in the Church over the Middle Ages. The Rogation days occur on 4 days each year, the Major Rogation, i.e. Greater Litanies, on April 25th and the Minor Rogation days, i.e. Lesser Litanies, on the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday before Ascension Thursday. These days have virtually disappeared now as only traditional Catholic priests keep them. However, for those who do keep these days, they are days to pray in a special way. The Litany of the Saints is especially prayed on these days and crops and fields are blessed. Concerning the Major Rogation, Dom Guéranger, writing in the late 1800s, mentions the ancient custom of abstinence but not fasting for the Major Rogation. Abstinence from flesh meat has always been observed on this day at Rome, and when the Roman liturgy was established in France by Pepin and Charlemagne, the Great Litany of April 25 was, of course, celebrated, and the abstinence kept by the faithful of that country. A council of Aix-la-Chapelle, in 836, enjoined the additional obligation of resting from servile work on this day. The same enactment is found in the Capitularia of Charles the Bald. As regards fasting, properly so called, being contrary to the spirit of Paschal time, it would seem never to have been observed on this day, at least not generally. Amalarius, who lived in the 9th century, asserts that it was not then practiced even in Rome. While Rome never adopted fasting on Rogation days, fasting can certainly be done by the faithful. The Church did though require abstinence from meat, illustrating that even during Paschaltide it is appropriate that we perform penance. Like Rogation days, Ember days developed early in these times, taking the form that would continue for centuries. The Catholic Encyclopedia explains, at first the Church in Rome had fasts in June, September, and December. The exact days were not fixed but were announced by the priests. The Liber Pontificalis ascribes to Pope Callistus, who reigned from 217 to 222, a law ordering the fast, but probably it is older. Leo the Great, who reigned from 440 to 461 AD, considers it an apostolic institution. By the time of Pope Gregory I, who died in 601 AD, they were observed for all 4 seasons, though the date of each of them could vary. In the Roman Synod of 1078 under Pope Gregory VII, they were uniformly established for the Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday after December 13, which is the feast of St. Lucy, after Ash Wednesday, after Pentecost Sunday, and after September 14, which is Holy Cross Day. The specific purpose of Ember Days is to thank God for the gifts of nature, to teach men to make use of them in moderation, and to assist the needy. As a result, their focus differs from the precise focus of the Rogation Days to which they are often compared. Likewise, the Advent fast which began in the early Church developed over these centuries. The fast which began in 480 began to adopt the same rigor of Lent by the end of the 6th century, when the fast was extended to the whole Church and priests were instructed to offer Mass during St. Martin's Lent, as it was then called, according to the Lenten rite. By the 700s, the Lenten observance was shortened in the Roman Rite to 4 weeks, though other rites maintained the longer observance. By the 1100s, the fast had begun to be replaced by simple abstinence. In 1281, the Council of Salisbury held that only monks were expected to keep the fast. However, in a revival of the older practice, Pope Urban V in 1362 required abstinence for all members of the papal court during Advent. However, the custom of fasting in Advent continued to decline, as we will learn in upcoming installments. We could do our part at rediscovering Advent by observing the Nativity fast, as it is still practiced to some extent in the Byzantine Catholic Church, starting on day after the feast of St. Martin, i.e. Martinmas, on November 11th. Some Byzantine traditions will refer to the feast as the Quadragesima of St. Philip, since it begins immediately after their feast day in honor of the Apostle St. Philip. The words of Pope Innocent III, who reigned from January 1198 to July 1216 before the Fourth Lateran Council, apply as much to us as to those who lived during the 13th century. To your praying add fasting and almsgiving. It is on these wings that our prayers fly the more swiftly and effortlessly to the holy ears of God, that He may mercifully hear us in the time of need. As the Middle Ages ended and the Renaissance emerged, the piety and devotion of many souls likewise became tempered. The Church underwent significant trials in these centuries, including the Protestant Revolt and the loss of hundreds of thousands of souls, yet she also found new children in lands previously undiscovered. Fasting and abstinence, along with holy days of obligation, were in practice highly varied depending on each nation and territory. We see this liturgical diversity in the various colonies. For instance, Catholics in the colonies in Florida and Louisiana observed these fasting days. The fasting days were all days in Lent: the Ember Days, the Avives of Christmas, Candlemas, Annunciation, Assumption, All Saints, the feasts of the Apostles except St. Philip and St. James and St. John, Nativity of St. John the Baptist, all Fridays except within 12 days of Christmas and between Easter and Ascension, and the Eve of Ascension. For abstinence from meat, they would have observed all Sundays in Lent, all Saturdays throughout the year, Monday and Tuesday before Ascension, and St. Mark's Day were of abstinence from flesh meat. The western colonies under Spanish rule in modern-day Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California observed as fast days all days in Lent except Sunday, Eves of Christmas, Whit Sunday, St. Matthias, St. John the Baptist, St. Peter, and St. Paul, St. James, St. Lawrence, Assumption, St. Bartholomew, St. Matthew, St. Simon, and St. Jude, All Saints, St. Andrew, and St. Thomas. It should be noted that in 1089 Pope Urban II granted a dispensation to Spain from abstinence on Fridays, in virtue of the Spanish efforts in the Crusades. After the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, Pope St. Pius V expanded that privilege to all Spanish colonies. That dispensation remained in place in some places as late as 1951, when the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, the last territory to invoke it, rescinded the privilege. There was a distinction made between Native Americans and European settlers. The papal bull of Pope Paul III in 1537 reduced the days of penance and those of hearing Mass for the Indians out of pastoral concern due to the physically demanding lifestyle that they lived, and also largely due to the fact that they fasted so much already. As a result, the only fasting days required under sin for the Native Americans were the Fridays in Lent, Holy Saturday, and Christmas Eve. As previously mentioned, The Lenten fast was originally observed as a single meal taken after sunset. By the 9th century, a small collation in the evening was introduced on account of the physical work done by the Benedictine monks. And the one meal was moved to 3 o'clock. By the 14th century, the meal had begun to move up steadily until it began to take place even at 12 o'clock. The change became so common it became part of the Church's discipline. In one interesting but often unknown fact, because the monks would pray the liturgical hour of noon before they would eat their meal, the custom of called midday by the name noon entered into our vocabulary as a result of the fast. With the meal moved up, the evening collation remained. In the Middle Ages, abstinence from meat on Fridays and during Lent was not only church law, it was civil law as well. And people gladly obeyed these laws out of respect for the teaching authority of the Church. Yet after the Protestant Revolt which began in 1517 and continued through the middle of the 1600s, this was to change. The same occurred in England which followed the revolt of Luther and his peers. King Henry VIII, who was previously given a title Defender of the Faith by Pope Leo X for his defense against Luther, succumbed to heresy and schism when he broke from Lord's established church on earth in 1533 to engage in adultery. Church property was seized. Catholics were killed. Catholicism was made illegal in England in 1559 under Queen Elizabeth I, and for 232 years, except during the brief reign of the Catholic King James II from 1685 to 1688, the Catholic Mass was illegal until 1791. Yet the Anglicans at least kept the Catholic customs of abstinence for some years. English royalty proclamations supporting abstinence of meat continued to occur in England in 1563, 1619, 1625, 1627, and 1631. The same likewise occurred in 1687 under King James II. After the Revolution in 1688 and the overthrow of Catholicism by William III and Mary II, the laws were no longer enforced and officially removed from the law books by the Statute Law Revision Act in 1863. Similar changes occurred throughout Europe as Protestants reviled the fast. But changes continued even in Catholic nations. In Ireland for instance the use of meat on all Wednesdays of the year was prohibited until around the middle of the 17th century. This harkened back to the vestige of earlier times when Wednesdays were days of weekly fasting as Father Slater notes in a short history of moral theology published in 1909. The obligation of fasting on all Wednesdays and Fridays ceased almost entirely about the 10th century, but the fixing of those days by ecclesiastical authority for fasting, and the desire to substitute a Christian observance at Rome for certain pagan rites celebrated in connection with the seasons of the year, seem to have given rise to our Ember Days. About the 10th century the obligation of the Friday fast was reduced to one of abstinence from flesh meat, and the Wednesday fast after being similarly mitigated gradually disappeared altogether. It was the saintly Archbishop of the 16th century, St. Charles Borromeo, the champion of the Counter-Reformation against the Protestants, who championed fasting and penance. Rogation days, which we covered in the previous installment, have been observed for centuries even if the Catholic Church in our modern era has virtually forgotten them. A similar situation occurred before in the Diocese of Milan. It was St. Charles who restored them and enhanced them in the Diocese of Milan. Interestingly, even though Rome never mandated fasting on the Rogation days, since they occur during the Easter season, St. Charles Borromeo mandated them in his own diocese. Dom Guéranger in the liturgical year provides us with a holy example that should show us the spirit of penance which should animate all of our lives on the Rogation days. St. Charles Borromeo, who restored in his diocese of Milan so many ancient practices of piety, was sure not to be indifferent about the Rogation days. He spared neither word nor example to reanimate this salutary devotion among his people. He ordered fasting to be observed during these 3 days. He fasted himself on bread and water. The procession, in which all the clergy of the city were obliged to join, and which began after the sprinkling of ashes, started from the cathedral at an early hour in the morning, and was not over till 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 13 churches were visited on the Monday, 9, on the Tuesday, and 11, on the Wednesday. The saintly Archbishop celebrated Mass and preached in one of these churches. St. Charles Borromeo did not only encourage the Rogation days. He ministered personally to thousands of plague-stricken victims when the civil authorities had fled Milan. He offered masses, administered the sacraments, consistently led processions, and offered an authentic Catholic response to a pandemic. The fast of Advent which had continued to decline had taken the form of only Wednesday and Friday penance. To stir the people to observe the true spirit of penance, even beyond the letter of the law, St. Charles also strongly urged those in Milan to fast on the Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays of each week of Advent. In one key distinction, Milan keeps the Ambrosian rite, which differs in several aspects from the Roman rite. One of those key differences is that Advent in the Ambrosian rite always begins on the Sunday after the feast of St. Martin of Tours, alluding back centuries before to St. Martin's Lent as it was practiced in the Roman rite. By the early modern era, the Church mandated three primary categories of fasts: the Lenten fast, the Ember Days, and the vigils of certain feasts. Likewise, to these both Friday and Saturday abstinence was observed, as the 1649 Douay Catechism affirms. Some of the most significant changes to fasting would occur under the reign of Pope Benedict XIV, who reigned from 1740 to 1758. On May 31, 1741, Pope Benedict XIV issued Non Ambiguitas, which granted permission to eat meat on fasting days while explicitly forbidding the consumption of both fish and flesh meat at the same meal on all fasting days during the year in addition to Sundays during Lent. Beforehand, the 40 days of Lent were held as days of complete abstinence from meat. The concept of partial abstinence was born even though the term would not appear until the 1917 Code of Canon Law. Yet even with these changes, Pope Benedict XIV implored the faithful to return to the devotion of earlier eras. The observance of Lent is the very badge of the Christian warfare. By it, we prove ourselves not to be enemies of the cross of Christ. By it, we avert the scourges of divine justice. By it, we gain strength against the princes of darkness, for it shields us with heavenly help. Should mankind grow remiss in their observance of Lent, it would be a detriment to God's glory, a disgrace to the Catholic religion, and a danger to Christian souls. Neither can it be doubted that such negligence would become the source of misery to the world, of public calamity, and of private woe. Sadly, Lent would only continue to wane in the centuries to come. Changes continued during the 18th and 19th centuries, as Antoine Villion's History of the Commandments from 1915 documents. The use of meat on Sundays, of Lent, was at first tolerated, then expressly permitted, for the greater part of Lent. Old people still remember the time when its use was completely forbidden in France from the Friday of Passion Week to Easter. Later, new dispensations allowed the gradual extension of the Sunday privilege to Tuesday and Thursday of each week, up to Thursday before Palm Sunday. About the beginning of the pontification of Pius IX, circa 1846, Monday was added to the days on which abstinence need not be observed. A few years later, the use of meat on those 4 days began to be permitted up to Wednesday of Holy Week. Lastly, the Saturdays, except Ember Saturday and Holy Saturday, were included in the dispensations. Changes likewise occurred early on in America's history. At the time of America's founding, the fast days observed by the new republic consisted of the Ember Days, the 40 days Lent, Wednesdays and Fridays in Advent, and the vigils of Christmas, Whitsun Sunday, i.e. Pentecost, Saints Peter and Paul, and All Saints. Abstinence was practiced on all Fridays and Saturdays of the year, unless a holy day of obligation were to occur on them. The Third Provincial Council of Baltimore in 1837, with the approval of Pope Gregory XVI, began to reduce these practices. The council dispensed from fast and abstinence the Wednesdays of Advent, except for the Ember Wednesday in Advent. At this time, complete abstinence was still observed on all Saturdays, but over the course of the 19th century, the dispensations from Saturday abstinence became universal. In 1840, the Fourth Provincial Council of Baltimore asked for a perpetual renewal of an indult dispensing from abstinence on Saturdays, and this indult was renewed for 20 years by Pope Gregory XVI. In 1866, the Second Plenary Council asked that all dispensations granted to the Diocese of Baltimore be extended to other American dioceses, but Pope Pius IX preferred individual requests from each bishop in the United States. In 1884, the U.S. bishops who were meeting at the Third Plenary Council decided it would be difficult to pass uniform legislation on the subject of fast and abstinence, and hence left it to the authority of provincial councils to determine what was best for their territories. Leo XIII in 1886 granted U.S. bishops the authority to dispense each year from abstinence on Saturdays. Similarly, Pope Gregory XVI, in a rescript from June 28, 1831, granted a dispensation to all Catholics of Scotland from abstinence on Saturdays throughout the year, except on Saturdays that were also days of fasting. Dispensations were granted in many nations, illustrating a weakening in discipline not only in America. With the growing number of Irish immigrants to America in the early 1800s, Special attention was given to dispensing from the law of abstinence when St. Patrick's Day fell on a Friday. This was done for the members of the Charitable Irish Society of Boston in 1837 and would become customary in the United States. Throughout the centuries covered thus far, abstinence included not only abstinence from meat but also generally from eggs and dairy products, though exceptions were granted in various localities. In 1886 Leo XIII allowed meat, eggs, and milk products on Sundays of Lent and at the main meal on every weekday of Lent, except Wednesday and Friday in the United States. Holy Saturday was not included in the dispensation. A small piece of bread was permitted in the morning with coffee, tea, chocolate, or a similar beverage. While the evening collation had been widespread since the 14th century, the practice of an additional morning snack, called a frustulum, was introduced only around the 18th century as part of the gradual relaxation of discipline. Volume 12 of The Jurist, published by the Catholic University of America in 1952, writes, "It is stated that the 2-ounce breakfast arose at the time of St. Alphonsus, since which time the usage of the popular 2 and 8-ounce standards for the breakfast and the collation, respectively, has been extant." Consequently, the Baltimore Manual published by the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore in 1884 states, "Only one full meal is allowed, to be taken about noon or later. Besides this full meal, a collation of 8 ounces is allowed. If the full meal is taken about the middle of the day, the collation will naturally be taken in the evening. If the full meal is taken late in the day, the collation may be taken at noon. Besides the full meal and collation, the general custom has made it lawful to take up to 2 ounces of bread, without butter, and a cup of some warm liquid, as coffee or tea, in the morning. This is important to observe, for by means of this many persons are enabled, and therefore obliged, to keep the fast who could not otherwise do so." The Catechism of Father Patrick Powers published in Ireland in 1905 mentions that abstinence includes flesh meat and anything produced from animals, as milk, butter, cheese, eggs. However, Father Patrick notes, in some countries, however, milk is allowed at collation. The United States was one of those nations whereas Ireland and others were not granted such dispensations. The use of eggs and milk during Lent was to drastically change in a few years with the 1917 Code of Canon Law. In 1895, the Working Men's Privilege gave bishops in the United States the ability to permit meat in some circumstances. Marmoro summarizes that these circumstances occurred when there was difficulty in observing the common law of abstinence, excluding Fridays, Ash Wednesday, Holy Week, and the Vigil of Christmas. This Working Men's Privilege, or indult, allowed only for meat once a day during Lent, taken at the principal meal, and never taken in conjunction with fish. This particular indult was extended not only to the laborer but to his family, as well. The motivation of such an indult was no doubt to allow for enough sustenance such that the many Catholic immigrants to the United States who worked as manual laborers could perform their difficult, energy-demanding physical work without danger to their health. Fasting days were also slowly reduced in Rome as well. By 1893, the only fasting days kept in Rome were the 40 days of Lent, the Ember Days, and the vigils of the Purification, of Pentecost, of St. John the Baptist, of Saints Peter and Paul, of the Assumption, of All Saints, and of Christmas. In just a few years, Rome would abrogate the fast on the vigil of the Purification and of St. John the Baptist. We have now come to the time of St. Pius X and the 1917 Code of Canon Law. While often held as an archetype for tradition, the 1917 Code largely took the concessions granted to America and other nations and reduced fasting practices that were widely practiced elsewhere in the world. It was at this same time that our Blessed Mother appeared in Fatima and called for more penance, precisely at a time when fasting was quickly fading. The Catholic Encyclopedia from 1909 in describing that fast immediately before the changes to occur under St. Pius X enumerates them as follows: in the United States of America all the days of Lent, the Fridays of Advent, generally, the Ember Days, the vigils of Christmas and Pentecost, as well as those of the Assumption, of All Saints, are now fasting days. In Great Britain, Ireland, Australia, and Canada, the days just indicated, together with the Wednesdays of Advent and the Vigil of Saints Peter and Paul, are fasting days. The days of obligatory fasting as listed in the 1917 Code of Canon Law were the 40 days of Lent, including Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday until noon, the Ember Days, and the Vigils of Pentecost, the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, All Saints, and Christmas. Partial abstinence, the eating of meat only at the principal meal, was obligatory on all weeks of Lent, Monday through Thursday. And of course, Complete abstinence was required on all Fridays, including Fridays of Lent, except when a holy day of obligation fell on a Friday outside of Lent. Saturdays in Lent were likewise days of complete abstinence. Fasting and abstinence were not observed should a vigil fall on a Sunday as stated in the Code. If a vigil that is a fast day falls on a Sunday, the fast is not to be anticipated on Saturday, but is dropped altogether that year. Effective per the 1917 Code of Canon Law, the Wednesdays and Fridays of Advent were no longer fast days for the Universal Church. Wednesdays of Advent had previously been abrogated as fast days in America in 1837. Now Fridays in Advent likewise ceased being required days of fast not only in America but universally. The Vigil of St. Peter and Paul also ceased as a fast day on the universal calendar, although it had already been abrogated in the United States. And eggs and milk, i.e. lactocinia, became universally permitted. But additional changes quickly ensued. Marmoro, writing on the fasting days around this time, states, in 1917 Pope Benedict XV granted the faithful of countries in World War I the privilege of transferring Saturday Lenten abstinence to any other day of the week, excepting Friday and Ash Wednesday. In 1919 Cardinal Gibbons was granted his request of transferring Saturday Lenten abstinence to Wednesday for all bishops' dioceses in the U.S. This permission, as well as the working men's privilege, were frequently renewed, but, after 1931, this permission was only on the basis of personal requests from individual bishops. Further, in 1931 Cardinal Fumasani Biondi, the apostolic delegate to the United States, addressed the following to the American bishops, the Sacred Congregation of the Council, in a letter dated October 15, 1931, informs me that, in view of the difficulties experienced by the faithful in observing the laws of fast and abstinence on civil holidays, His Holiness, Pius XI, in the audience of October 5, 1931, granted to all the ordinaries of the United States, ad quinquennium, the faculty to dispense their subjects from the laws in question whenever any of the civil holidays now observed occurs on a day of fast and abstinence, or of abstinence. Pope Pius XII accelerated the changes to fasting and abstinence as Father Ruff relates. In 1941 Pope Pius XII allowed bishops worldwide to dispense entirely from fast and abstinence except on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, provided that there was abstinence from meat every Friday, and fast and abstinence on these 2 days and the Vigil of the Assumption and Christmas. Eggs and milk products were permitted at breakfast and in the evening. On January 28, 1949, the United States bishops modified the regulations on abstinence in America again after receiving a ruling from the Sacred Congregation of the Council. Partial abstinence replaced complete abstinence for Ember Wednesdays, Ember Saturdays, and the Vigil of Pentecost. Before 1951, bishops were able to dispense laborers and their family members from the laws of abstinence, if necessary, under the working men's privilege that was introduced in 1895. This privilege of eating meat though excluded Fridays, Ash Wednesday, Holy Week, and the Vigil of Christmas. In 1951, the abstinence laws in America were again revised as Father Ruff summarizes. In 1951 the U.S. bishops standardized regulations calling for complete abstinence from meat on Fridays, Ash Wednesday, the Vigils of Assumption and Christmas, and Holy Saturday morning for everyone over age 7. On the Vigils of Pentecost and All Saints, meat could be taken at just one meal. Fast days, applying to everyone between 21 and 59, were the weekdays of Lent, Ember Days, and the Vigils of Pentecost, Assumption, All Saints, and Christmas. On these fast days, only one full meal was allowed, with 2 other meatless meals permitted which together did not make up one full meal. Eating between meals was not permitted, with milk and fruit juice permitted. Health or ability to work exempted 1. As a result, the Vigil of All Saints was reduced to partial abstinence for American Catholics only in 1951. In 1954, Pope Pius XII issued a special decree granting bishops the permission to dispense from Friday abstinence for the Feast of St. Joseph, which that year fell on a Friday. A March 26, 1954 article in The Guardian elaborates, bishops throughout the world have been granted the faculty to dispense their faithful from the law of abstinence on the Feast of St. Joseph, Friday, March 19. The power was granted in a decree issued by the Sacred Congregation of the Council, which said it acted at the special mandate of His Holiness Pope Pius XII. The decree was published and L'Osservatore Romano made no mention of a dispensation from the Lenten fast. 1955 saw some of the most significant changes to the Church's liturgy since the Council of Trent. Pope Pius XII on March 23, 1955, abolished 15 octaves in addition to the octave for the dedication of a church, and particular octaves for patrons of various religious orders, countries, dioceses, etc. He also abolished roughly half of all vigils, leading to the removal of the liturgical vigils of the Immaculate Conception, Epiphany, All Saints, and all Apostles except Saints Peter and Paul. The total number of liturgical vigils was now reduced to 7. Uncertainty existed on whether or not fasting was still required on October 31st, the Vigil of All Saints, commonly called Halloween. The U.S. bishops requested an official determination from Rome on whether the custom of fasting and abstinence on the suspended Vigil of All Saints had also been terminated. They received a pre-printed notice in a response dated March 15, 1957, stating, "The decree of the Sacred Congregation of Rites looks simply to the liturgical part of the day and does not touch the obligation of fast and abstinence that are a penitential preparation for the following feast day." The U.S. bishop thereafter dispensed both the fast and partial abstinence law for the Vigil of All Saints. In 1956, Holy Saturday was commuted from complete to partial abstinence. Furthermore, the fast which previously ended at noon was extended to the midnight between Holy Saturday and Easter Sunday, on account of the Holy Week changes enacted by Pius XII. In some places, the previous ending at noon continued where custom or concession prevailed. And on July 25, 1957, Pope Pius XII commuted the fast in the Universal Church from the Vigil of the Assumption to the Vigil of the Immaculate Conception on December 7, even though he had previously abrogated the Mass for the Vigil of the Immaculate Conception. On October 9, 1958, Pope Pius XII died. John XXIII was elected, and under him, as under his predecessor, changes to church discipline continued. In 1959, John XXIII permitted the Christmas Eve fast and abstinence to be transferred to the 23rd. While the United States, Great Britain, and Ireland kept the penance on December 24, other nations including Canada and the Philippines transferred it to December 23. By 1962, the laws of fasting and abstinence were as follows, as described in Moral Theology by Reverend Heribert Yone and adapted by Reverend Urban Edelman for the Laws and Customs of the United States of America, copyright 1961. Complete abstinence is to be observed on all Fridays of the year, Ash Wednesday, the Vigils of Immaculate Conception and Christmas. Partial abstinence is to be observed on Ember Wednesdays and Saturdays and on the Vigil of Pentecost. Days of fast are all the weekdays of Lent, Ember Days, and the Vigil of Pentecost. If a vigil falls on a Sunday, the law of abstinence and fasting is dispensed that year and is not transferred to the preceding day. Father Yone adds additional guidance for the Vigil of the Nativity fast. General custom allows one who is fasting to take a double portion of food at the collation on Christmas Eve, called the Joyful Fast. It should be noted that no universal dispensation from the popes were ever issued for the Friday after Thanksgiving, contrary to what some claim. Thus, even before the Second Vatican Council opened, the fasting customs were drastically reduced within only a few hundred years. Shortly after the close of the Second Vatican Council, Paul VI an Apostolic Constitution on Fasting and Abstaining on February 17, 1966, called Pena Temini, whose principles were later incorporated into the 1983 Code of Canon Law. Pena Temini allowed the commutation of the Friday abstinence to an act of penance at the discretion of the local ordinaries and gave authority to the episcopal conferences on how the universal rules would be applied in their region. Abstinence, which previously began at age 7, was modified to begin at age 14. Additionally, the obligation of fasting on the Ember Days and on the remaining vigils was abolished. Pena Temini maintained the traditional practice that abstinence is to be observed on every Friday which does not fall on a day of obligation. The NCCB issued a statement on November 18, 1966. Abstinence was made obligatory on all Fridays of Lent, except solemnities, i.e. first-class feasts, on Ash Wednesday, and on Good Friday. Abstinence on all Fridays throughout the year was especially recommended, and the faithful who did choose to eat meat were directed to perform an alternative penance on those Fridays outside of Lent, even though the U.S. bishops removed the long-established precept of requiring Friday penance. The document stated in part, "Even though we hereby terminate the traditional law of abstinence binding under pain of sin, as the sole prescribed means of observing Friday, we hope that the Catholic community will ordinarily continue to abstain from meat by free choice as formerly we did in obedience to church law." And finally, fasting on all weekdays of Lent was strongly recommended but not made obligatory under penalty of sin. The 1983 Code of Canon Law largely took Paul VI's Apostolic Constitution aside from the modification of the age at which fasting binds. Per the 1983 Code of Canon Law, the age of fast was changed to begin at 18, previously it was 21, and to still conclude at midnight when an individual completes his 59th birthday. Friday penance is required per these laws on all Fridays of the year except on solemnities, a dramatic change from the previous exception being only on holy days of obligation. Per the 1983 Code of Canon Law, fasting and complete abstinence per these rules are required only on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. The notion of partial abstinence, introduced under Pope Benedict XIV in 1741, was also removed along with nearly all fast days. Year-round Friday abstinence is required by the 1983 Code of Canon Law but largely ignored by Catholics. The following is quoted from the 1983 Code of Canon Law. Canon 1249, all Christ's faithful are obliged by divine law, each in his or her own way, to do penance. However, so that all may be joined together in a certain common practice of penance, days of penance are prescribed. On these days the faithful are in a special manner to devote themselves to prayer, to engage in works of piety and charity, and to deny themselves, by fulfilling their obligations more faithfully and especially by observing the fast and abstinence which the following canons prescribe. Canon 1250, the days and times of penance for the Universal Church are each Friday of the whole year and the season of Lent. Canon 1251, abstinence from meat, or from some other food as determined by the Episcopal Conference, is to be observed on all Fridays, unless a solemnity should fall on a Friday. Abstinence and fasting are to be observed on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. Canon 1252, the law of abstinence binds those who have completed their 14th year. The law of fasting binds those who have attained their majority, until the beginning of their 60th year. Pastors of souls and parents are to ensure that even those who by reason of their age are not bound by the law of fasting and abstinence, are taught the true meaning of penance. Canon 1253, the Episcopal Conference can determine more particular ways in which fasting and abstinence are to be observed. In place of abstinence or fasting it can substitute, in whole or in part, other forms of penance, especially works of charity and exercises of piety. And thus, Catholics are required without exception to abstain from meat on Fridays in Lent. Catholics are also required to abstain from meat on all Fridays of the year unless the Bishops' Conference of that area allows an alternative penance to be performed. Many faithful Catholics however choose just to honor the tradition of fish on Fridays year-round instead of substituting an alternative. This is in line with Catholic tradition and the 1917 Code of Canon Law which did not allow an alternative penance. If you cannot resist having meat on Friday, how can you possibly resist more insidious assaults from the devil? In Lent, there is no substituting allowed. You also cannot transfer your abstinence from Friday to a different day like Thursday or Saturday. It must take place on Friday. What we have lost. Today the number of fasting days in the Universal Church, including in the United States, is sadly only 2, Good Friday and Ash Wednesday. Where has the rhythm and rhyme of the Catholic life gone? The two cornerstones of Catholic life for centuries were Sunday Mass and Friday abstinence. And they are both quickly becoming extinct. While no authority in the Church may change or alter any established dogmas of the faith, the discipline of both holy days of obligation and fast days may change. The days of obligation and the days of penance are matters of discipline, not matters of dogma. Lawful authorities in the Church do have the power to change these practices. In the observance of the two precepts, namely attending Holy Mass on prescribed days and fasting and abstaining on commanded days, we obey them because the Church has the power by Christ to command such things. We do not abstain from meat on Fridays for instance because the meat is unclean or evil. It is the act of disobedience that is evil. As Father Michael Muller remarks in his familiar explanation of Christian doctrine from 1874, it is not the food, but the disobedience that defiles a man. To eat meat on a forbidden day unintentionally, for instance, is no sin. As the Scriptures affirm, it is not what goes into one's mouth that defiles a man but that disobedience that comes from the soul. Yet, even with such a distinction, the Church has historically been wise to change disciplines only very slowly and carefully. As Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen once remarked, it is a long-established principle of the Church never to completely drop from her public worship any ceremony, object or prayer which once occupied a place in that worship. The same may be said for matters concerning either holy days of obligation or fast days. What our forefathers held sacred should remain sacred to us in an effort to preserve our Catholicity not only with ourselves but with our ancestors who see God now in heaven. Perhaps we need to ask ourselves and our own families what we can do, even if not mandated by church law, to recover these former holy days of obligation and fasting days. Fasting and or abstaining from meat and animal products on the 40 days of Lent, the days of Advent, the vigils of feasts, Ember days, Rogation days, and Saturdays year-round would be commendable. In a similar manner, observing the Apostles' Fast or the Assumption Fast, which are still kept in the Eastern churches, would also be praiseworthy for a Roman Catholic. Rediscover a love of fasting. The Church has over time reduced the requirements required under penalty sin, but she still implores the faithful to do more than the mere minimum. But in reality, are we? Saint Francis de Sales remarked in the 16th and early 17th century, "If you're able to fast, you will do well to observe some days beyond what are ordered by the Church." What days can you add? How can you better observe the feast days of the Apostles or the feasts of our Lord or Our Lady? How can we fast better, both in terms of the number of days as well as by limiting the food we consume on fast days? Can you for instance fast and abstain from meat voluntarily on Saturdays in honor of Our Lady and for the purpose of doing penance? May God grant us a love of fasting for the glory and honor of His name and for the good of souls. This history of Catholic fasting